Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the West Partnership session, working in collaboration with Education Scotland on family community engagement. I am absolutely delighted to have along today Emily Morris from Brookings Institution and Sophie Partington as well. They are joining us from Washington DC. Today we're also joined by Susan Doherty and Beverly Ferguson from Education Scotland, who have been central to the family learning programme that is run by the West Partnership. And today we've been absolutely delighted to offer this in collaboration with Education Scotland, so that we can have practitioners from across Scotland joining us. So to introduce Emily to you, Emily is a fellow at Brookings Institution, and she is also the head of family, school and community engagement team. And further to this, Emily is also a professorial lecturer, hopefully I said that correctly, at American University. So I'm not going to talk for much longer. I am just going to hand over now to Emily, who is going to hopefully end your day with lots of valuable information.
Great, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. And Sophie and I are very excited to speak to you about some of the research and some of the findings and strategies and conversations that are happening globally, and also hear from you all on the work that you're doing. And so we will start off our presentation on transforming education systems through family school community collaboration. Just a note that Sophie is a research assistant with the team and has worked with the team for a long time as well. And so she'll be sharing and presenting a little bit. I forgot to mention also, I am on a parent-teacher organization for the public schools here in the US. So I also work with schools as a parent teacher on the family school community engagements also, as well as with the research teams. So I'm going to share our screen and tell you a little bit about what we have planned for today, just to make sure. Can everyone see my screen okay? Thumbs up, Sophie, if you can see. Great. All right. So we will be talking about the research as well as the conversations, but I wanted to start by just understanding from your perspectives a little bit. In one word, what would you describe family school and community engagement looks like in the schools that you work with today? So in one word, what does it look like in the schools you work with? And if you could enter that into the chat, if you're able, type one word. And give another couple of seconds for people to be able to enter. Great. I'm seeing inclusive, relationships, collaborative, partnership, difficult, inconsistent, family learning, uniform swap, inclusive but limited, relationships, patchy, great, inconsistent. So kind of a combination of inclusive and relationships, but also patchy and inconsistent. Varies. Great. I'm going to ask you to build on that, and then in another word, can you describe what you hope that family school community would look like in a year from today? So if you really had kind of the resources and opportunities and the ability to sort of hope and think forward, what would you like? What would be the word that would describe how it would look like 1 year from today? Great. I'm seeing inclusive, positive, integral, one team, effective, valued, busy, active, collaborative. And so I'm going to keep these words in mind, and sustainable. Good. Sustainable, supportive. keep these words in mind as sort of as we keep working through. I see another word, authentic, in here as well. And so the work that we're trying to do is to try to do just this, to help listen to teams and understand what family school community engagement looks like. Where do people want to go with family school and community engagement? And then what strategies and what tools and research can we use to build more positive, more integral, more valued, more sustainable, more authentic relationships between family, school, and community. So thank you for all of these inputs, and also I'm seeing in the chat reflective. And so we have some research that we do that is exactly that, is to help teams be reflective and how in ways that are authentic to the context and to the community to really build more supportive and more integrated and inclusive approaches. So I am going to just briefly introduce Center for Universal Education at Brookings and who we are. We are a research institution. We are a nonpartisan think tank. We are based in Washington, D.C., but our work is really global. We work in countries and with communities and policymakers, teams, and schools around the world. And we are really all about creating free-to-use education research and tools to collaborate with communities and teams to ensure that data is useful for teams as well as for looking forward to policy and equity, and ensuring that all at the core of our work that all young people are really developing skills to thrive in their work, their lives, their their civic engagement, as well as really thinking about how to connect communities around the world to learn from each other, to learn with each other, and to push our collective education and policy and practice environment. So that's a little bit about us and our team of family, school, and community engagement at Brookings. There are 7 of us on our team that work with teams and communities and countries around the world. I'm going to hand to Sophie, who is going to introduce a little bit about our playbook research, and then I will pick up again and talk a little bit about why family, school, community engagement from the research and from the practice is so key to the work that we do with schools. So I'm going to hand to Sophie to introduce our playbook research.
Thanks, Emily. So as Emily said, our team at Brookings has been focused on family, school, community engagement research for more than 3 years now. And the sort of foundation of our work is our playbook, which was published a little over 2 years ago in fall of 2021. And the playbook is really aimed at anyone in the education system at the school system level and above. And it offers insights into the benefits of family, school, community engagement from a research perspective, and as well as providing real-world examples and tools that can help to improve engagement practices in your jurisdiction. And those tools and that research is what we will be diving into more deeply today. Emily, if you can move to the next slide, we just wanted to lay out quickly our 3 collective objectives for today, which are 1, to give you space to reflect on your work with family, school, and community engagement. 2, for you to learn from our research, our data, and the strategies that we have collected over the past few years. And 3, to take away these learnings for your own practices moving forward. So before we dive into what our research is, we wanted to give you a sense of how do we develop our research. So how we work really is that we work in very close collaboration with a network of 50 partner organizations across 12 countries, which includes governments, civil society organizations, and school networks. And it's thanks to these organizations that over the past 3+ years, we've reached almost 33,000 parents, 8,000 teachers, and 7,000 students through surveys and focus groups. We also conduct interviews with education decision makers across the globe. We source and analyze more than 500 strategies from implementer groups on good practices for family school engagement. And of course, we are a research institution, so we consult academic literature and experts as part of our research process as well. And I mentioned just now on the previous slide that we work closely with a network of 50 project collaborators. So I wanted to show you this visual. of what we call our Family Engagement in Education Network, of which Education Scotland is a part of. So this is giving you a sense of the global spread of the partners that we work with, which, like I mentioned, are from governments, from at the national, state, and district levels, from civil society, from funder organizations, and a few school networks as well. So with that, I will turn things back over to Emily.
The core of what our work is really about is supporting family school community engagement to support children's learning and development, as well as helping schools thrive. And so the research, there's a lot of research around the world that really links this family school community engagement. And in some recent research from this past year that was published by Karen Mapp and Ann Henderson and others, really looking at how family school community engagement is connected to a child's motivation, their cognitive abilities, social adjustment, and all of these, how family school and community engagement really supports this an increase in their motivation, their cognitive ability, but also at a level of social competence, which includes persistence, self-regulation, positive relationships. And as a result, that students had higher rates of achievement, lower rates of grade retention, delinquency, truancy from school, as well as need for social services. So this is research that they've been doing in the US, but also globally on this linkage between family school community engagement in a child's cognitive development, social development, as well as sort of their experience in school over time, and then also their completion and their going on to further education and needs for services. So there's really a lot of research that connects the important role of family school and community engagement from a child. There's also research that looks at it from the level of sort of school improvement, as well as trust and why that's important. And so there's research that really looks at how schools with strong relational trust between family, teachers, and administrators are more likely to improve student learning outcomes. And so this important link between building trust between families, teachers, and administrators to support student learning. And so that's a key of what we'll be talking about today, is also how to have conversations to build this trust, and to kind of, from your earlier words in the chat, building more integral and more supportive, more effective partnerships. But we also have literature that does show, that looks at the cost effectiveness of this approach, and how communicating with families is really an important approach and cost effective approach. There is research that pulls even deeper on relational trust of families, and showing that this relational trust sometimes can be even more predictive of learning outcomes and socioeconomic status, which we often assume is kind of one of the major predictors of outcomes. But that within this, relational trust is a really, really big key area, and the work of Brick and Schneider and others in this area. We also have research that really looks at how a shared vision, so how really understanding beliefs and understanding differences in beliefs is key for reforms and for transforming education and efforts to really look at systematic reform. And so this ability to sort of understand where beliefs align on education and expectations is really also key. So these are some of the snippets from the research, the background research on why family school and community engagement is important. And each of you know, in the ways that you work and in your own communities and schools, the importance of family school community engagement. But these are just some of the pieces from the research. When we talk about family engagement, we often think about it as family involvement and engagement, and not to say that family involvement is not key. It is really important to the conversation, but we're also trying to push for a little bit deeper family engagement. What do we mean by this? So this was one of our collaborating partners in Pittsburgh, US, and Pennsylvania, that helped take some of the research from Brick and Schneider and others to really help us to show what is family involvement engagement, to help teams understand how to deepen engagement, and really involvement being leading with the mouth at the schools, telling teachers, telling parents how they can contribute, how should they show up, and inviting them in, but telling them the ways that they should contribute, and really thinking of them more as we're serving clients versus engagement, which is really listening to parents, understanding their hopes, their aspirations for students, listening to students, listening to teachers as well, but really leading with the ears and really thinking about partnerships as a goal of this work, and thinking about how to gain partnerships. So again, involvement is really key, but engagement is also what we're trying to focus on, and how to really understand parents thinking and teachers thinking and students thinking to gain trust and to gain partnerships. Our work is really built on the work of building trust and relational trust, and really understanding how building trust, it's not agreeing on the beliefs on education or satisfaction, but it's understanding where our beliefs are coming from, what is informing that, as well as the opportunities and our experiences with education to help build that trust. And so we found in general with the research we're doing and across the research that when teachers are more receptive to families' inputs, that families feel they're on the same page with teachers about what makes for good education, and vice versa. When teachers feel like they're having parents that are receptive to their inputs, that they can be on the same page, and that these building relationships is just ultimately essential to effective family, school, and community engagement and collaboration. Where there is not sufficient trust, it is very hard to move towards partnerships, to help move towards strategies that really create these inclusive, these positive relationships. So our work is really centered here on trust. What do we mean by trust? We use the 4 key areas that Brookings Schneider sort of lay out in their research, and that's respect, and are we seeking input and listening carefully what families have to say, and vice versa? Are we listening carefully to what teachers have to say? And competence, demonstrating to families that we think they're doing a good job as parents and caregivers, and vice versa, that we demonstrate that we think that teachers are doing a good job as educators. Integrity, keeping word with families, teachers keeping word with families, and families keeping their word with teachers. And then personal regard, showing families that we care about them as people, as a community, and likewise sharing and caring about teachers and them as people and as educators. So these are the 4 key areas from the research that has been done on relational trust, respect, competence, integrity, and personal regard, which I'll talk about sort of through our research with communities and with schools. We are also thinking about all the different research and all the different barriers of family, school, and community engagement, and we've collapsed these really into 3 key areas. And we'll have an opportunity also to understand a little bit more about what are you experiencing in your schools. But we're finding that lack of personnel and training and support. So oftentimes educators and school leaders and other levels in the school are expected and need to engage with families, but whether or not they have the support to do that, or whether or not they even feel they have the background and the training. We've heard a lot of school leaders saying, I engage with families all the time, but I actually never had any support or training or support in the process. And as conversations get contentious, it becomes even harder for me to understand kind of the best approaches for engaging in this. And same with teachers. Very few, from the research we've done, very few teacher training institutions and teacher preparation institutions actually have time and space in their preparation programs that support teachers on how do you effectively engage with families of different demographics and experiences, and how can you build partnership. And so it's an often expectation, but without the training and the support. We also find that a legacy of structural oppressions, and so language and race and class and gender and all different legacies of communities and schools, and how they partner and how they communicate and how they work together is also key to understand. And all these how to build trust really does also understanding parents and families' experiences with school, whether it's the first time they're engaging with a new education system in a community that they've recently moved to, or a community they've been part of for generations. There's often understanding sort of these relationships with schools, and also areas of fear of schools as well, is important to understand in order to build these trusting relationship. And then it's attention in the work that we do, and getting time for fun and resources for funding and research, and to really be able to do this work. We find that time is a very big barrier, as well as resources for really developing these sustainable partnerships. So these are from the research. I want to just take a moment to let you think and express in the chat and reflect. And if we have a moment, we'll also get one or two people, if you're willing to share out loud. But what is the most pressing challenge with family, school, and community engagement in the schools you work with? So I shared three overarching barriers, but what is your biggest challenge in a few words? And if you want to share that in the chat, I'll give you a minute to do that right now. Keep entering them in, and I'm going to just kind of summarize some of what I'm seeing, and then invite one or two of you if you want to elaborate a little bit further. I'm seeing kind of getting parents to come in, whether it's resources for childcare or time of parents, or even willingness of parents. Sometimes it's experiences that parents have with school, negative experiences or trauma with school, that they had that they carry with them as a parent. I'm seeing encouragement, how to encourage parents to engage and participate, and the authority, and seeing school as the authority, and understanding whether or not, where parents' role is in kind of collaborating with the school. I'm seeing also time and skills of the staff to build relationships, time of the schools, but also thinking about which parents to engage, which parents are historically not really engaged in the schools, and historically marginalized families, as well as thinking about also understanding their experiences, and thinking about getting physically to transport to the schools, and then inviting parents online communication. How do we think beyond just the school environment? Language barriers, whether or not parents speak fluently the languages spoken by the school team. And I'm seeing lack of confidence of parents, fear of being judged, which goes back to their sort of experience with school, attitudes, confidence, time, willingness, experiences, literacy as well, whether or not parents can read the information going home or understand the information going home to them in the language which it's being communicated, and workload demands of teachers on how to build these relationships, and school leaders. Difficulty in parent councils, family councils, and then also prioritization within the school. And is it more than one person, or is it really a collective responsibility to school? So these are all really great challenges that we've been hearing and thinking about. I was going to invite perhaps one or two people, if you want to share in a minute or two, kind of your experience at school. So I'll pause if any of you want to come off mute and share a little bit about your experience with this challenge. And go ahead, and if it's, we can also pass on sharing and share for another one, but also if you, I'll give just kind of another minute if someone wants to share your experience. So I see Mary speaking. Go ahead, Mary. Thank you.
Hi, I find that parents will engage in a one-to-one very well with school. They'll come in frequently, they have good conversations, we have good relationships. And they'll come into an event where they get to sit and look at a presentation. It's the planning, the collaborating, the self-evaluation. That's the part that parents find a barrier to getting involved in. And it's how we get over that part, because the one-to-one is good. The sharing of here's a presentation, something we want to tell you is good, but the actual working together part is where it kind of falls down, and parents maybe don't want the commitment, or they're afraid of being part of it. I think a lot of the things you've already spoken of, but I would say for us, that's the bit we need to build, that's the bit we want to find a way to get through those barriers.
Great. And so just to kind of recap, I think this idea of we can often get parents in perhaps to events, and maybe one-on-one conferences or conversations, but then how do we actually work together and get those commitments to actually further that work together? So that's great. So thank you so much, Mary, for sharing. I'm going to give, before we move on to sort of the research, anyone else, feel free to raise your hand if you want to share kind of your own experience. Great. I have Underbank, H. Underbank. You feel free to share.
Hi there. I would have said that we had really positive engagement prior to COVID, but the impact that COVID has had, where staff weren't really able to engage with parents, has had a really negative impact. And the fact that almost 3 years of our intake haven't actually seen that partnership and that engagement, and so they're not aware of how positive it was. And so I think that's our biggest challenge, is engaging those families who are new to us.
Great. And so just echoing that we've heard a lot of this from schools around the world as well, that this impact on COVID, it really has shifted, and perhaps the ways that we relied on for family school community engagement, whether as in events, we haven't been able to sort of maintain that during COVID, and it really has shifted the way. Some teams have also communicated that they've had new ways of engaging families in the COVID era, and that they've learned that. So I think it's taking a reflective look to the point you just made is an important point of this work, and thinking about, okay, as we move and have experienced challenges during COVID to family school community engagement, where do we want to go next, and how can we take what we've learned and also think about doing things differently as we go forward, and what are some good strategies to take with us. So thank you so much, both of you, for sharing. I'm going to keep going in the research, but always feel free in the chat to, if you have something that you're thinking about or as a question that comes up, to always feel free to enter it in the chat, and Sophie will help ensure that we address those today. So I'm going to keep going and talk a little bit about what is some of the research that we're doing and the intentional conversations that we're doing with schools and communities around the world. So our team has really been co-constructing and co-developing a set of tools for school leaders and school communities to use around having intentional conversations. And the purpose is to create these tools and to offer them to teams if they're helpful in their building of relationships and really coming together with families and schools together. And so this work I'll talk a little bit about is part of our ongoing research and work, and we're working with, at the moment, 13 countries around the world and teams within these countries that are helping kind of co-build these tools. Our process is 4 key steps. it's really contextualizing. So thinking about in the communities that we're working with, so whether it's Colombia or Brazil or England or Australia or Sierra Leone or South Africa or Bangladesh, it's really understanding why are we doing this work for family school community, what's at the center of this, and then also what are the communities that are historically marginalized or not, the families that are most engaged in schools, and thinking intentionally about who and how are we engaging families and thinking about this from a context. Then we also survey and analyze beliefs and perspectives on school, of beliefs of teachers, beliefs of parents, beliefs of students, for teams that are working also with more secondary school and older children. We come together then to reflect and to discuss these beliefs, this data that we've collected from parents and teachers through surveys, and then ultimately is to develop an active strategy. So what does this look like? Is this reinventing our pre-COVID events into a different ways that are more inclusive? Is it acknowledging that families don't always want to travel to the school to be engaged? So how can we think of also bringing school to families, whether it's virtually, whether it's in communities? So I think every school and team that we're working with is creating strategies that are responsive, and we'll share at the end of some of the strategies that we've been learning and collecting with teams around our world. So part of our work is also to collect different strategies, to share these strategies so that communities and teams can see what others are doing and learn from other approaches. So this is our what we call our conversation starter process, a process for doing this research. And the intent of the research is not to confirm or generalize what teachers or what parents believe, but it's to create intentional conversations that'll lead to better trust and to deeper strategies for partnering. Contextualizing, what do we mean? We often start with teams by really thinking about, okay, what are the education and literacy levels and the languages spoken, some of the challenges that you've outlined as well in the chat. We think about gender. Is it parents, is parents and caregivers are male and female caregivers, parents engaging similarly? Is there differences? Disabilities, are children with disabilities, are parents engaging in similar ways or different ways? Are parents with disabilities? We think about ethnicity and race, as well as geography, rural, urban, socioeconomic status of families and schools, and really understanding what are critical to really understanding family school community engagement, and not just the barriers, but also the opportunities. We then look at really capturing beliefs and perspectives. So we have surveys that look at beliefs on education. So what do families and teachers think is the main purpose of school? When are they most satisfied with school, of their children's education or their students' education? Beliefs on teaching and learning or pedagogy, on how things are taught. But these different beliefs that parents bring with them and teachers bring with them to school and their relationships with school. We look at relational trust and alignment, so feeling respected for their values, their inputs and their ideas, being able to feel like they're respected and cared for as a parent or as a teacher. So we look at relational trust. We also look at ways that families are involved. So is it committees? Is it events? Is it financial contributions? Is it volunteering? What are the different ways that families are engaged? Is it helping their children at home with learning? And then it's also the barriers. So some of the things that you've identified, as well as what are some of the key barriers that parents are experiencing, also that teachers have observed and think our parents are experiencing as well in their engagement. So we look at these across, and then we really map these out and look at the beliefs. But before we even jump into what our research has found, we wanted to ask you in the chat to just say what your thoughts are. So I'm going to give you an example of one of the questions that we ask. So on our survey, we ask, what is the most important of school? And you'll see 4 letters: academic, economic, civic. We don't have that on the survey. That's really our coding. We ask parents and we ask teachers to answer this, and students in some contexts. What do you think is the most important purpose of school? Is it to really further education, to, for example, going on to post-secondary? Is it to develop work skills? Is it to become active community members or citizens? Is it to understand oneself and develop social skills or value? Or is it a purpose that is not well captured here? And so before I go into the sort of the beliefs, I would love in the chat if you would be willing to share, what do you think is the most important purpose of school? And you can write either academic, economic, civic, socio-emotional, or you can also enter another purpose if one of these doesn't capture. So feel free to enter into the chat what you think the most important purpose of school. And I'll give you a minute to do that. Great, like about 30 more seconds. Great. Okay. I'm going to keep going, but feel free if you haven't entered to enter it in. And I'm seeing a lot of different responses. I'm seeing socio-emotional and academic. I'm seeing a lot of socio-emotional, some civic, a little bit of economic, and then I'm seeing a number of people that are saying we can't choose one. They're all related, and there may be one or more that we feel is really important. And I think with the research that we've been doing, I'll talk a little bit about maybe what I'll do is really talk about some of the maps and then why we ask parents and teachers really to focus on one, recognizing for most people that four is really important, and this idea of kind of lifelong learning and some of the ways that you've sort of articulated in your own context and beliefs on the school, and we'll have a little bit of time for conversation as well on that. But let me, before I jump into sort of why we ask parents and teachers to focus on one, I'm going to go to just some of what we found in one of the schools. So I'm going to go to Southwestern Pennsylvania. And so like I've said, we've been doing this work in a number of countries in Asia, Africa, Europe, North America, as well as Latin America. I'm going to share one of the examples from Pennsylvania in the US that the 22 districts looked at and took part in this survey across these different schools, public schools, government schools. And we mapped out what their different thinking was. And so you'll see, if you can see the blue bubble or the 34% on the left, you'll see under academic that parents' main purpose was somewhere between socio-emotional and academic. It was kind of a mix between socio-emotional and academic, but for teachers, it was really very clearly socio-emotional learning. We found this to be the case in India. We found this to be the case in Brazil. There are other communities where civic is very high or economic is very high in terms of beliefs. And so we then look at sort of where these beliefs fall. We look at where are there big white space or gaps between the belief. And so the biggest white space or gap is actually with the academic learning, and where parents are prioritizing this at a higher level than teachers. And so one of the key parts of the question that the teachers wanted to talk about in this group of districts is, why is this the case, and why are parents so focused on academic? But likewise, parents wanted to understand, why are teachers and educators so focused on social-emotional learning? What is that? Why is that so key? And then parents also having the opportunity to talk about their concerns with the focus on social-emotional, being that they're scared that their kids are going to fall behind with literacy or math or other outcomes. In Colombia, the teachers and parents conversation, parents expressing, I don't know how to help my child I haven't gone on to secondary school or post-secondary school. I don't really know how to help with the learning part of the academic learning, but I do know how to help with social emotional. But you know, how does social emotional help with my child? And so they had a lot of time to focus on those conversations. We also ask perceptions of the other. So we ask for teachers and teachers to give their perceptions of what parents believe, and parents to give their perceptions of what teachers believe, what they think they prioritize. In the case of Southwestern Pennsylvania, you'll see very few gaps, and the circle is parents' actual beliefs. Again, that academic and socio-emotional learning was really key. The diamond is teachers' perceptions of parents. So teachers, what they think parents' actual beliefs are. And you can see that these are fairly close together, which means that teachers really, for the most part, understand where their parents are coming from. Maybe there's a little bit more gap in thinking that actually parents are a little bit higher on socio-emotional learning than the teachers anticipated that they were. But for the most part, the teachers understand where their parents are coming from, which is not the case in all communities. There's often bigger gaps, and the biggest gap maybe being here, where teachers thought that parents were actually prioritizing academic more than parents were actually prioritizing. If we look at the difference with where the orange circle, the circle here being teachers' actual beliefs, which we said was socio-emotional is sort of their priority, and we look at the diamond, or what parents perceive of teachers to believe, we see a large white space or a large gap, meaning that the parents perceive that teachers are prioritizing academic learning. So academic learning being ensuring their children get through school, further their education, go on to post-secondary education, when in fact teachers were really more focused on the socio-emotional. So we, in the conversations that they had, focused on this gap of perception and really digging into why. When we get into looking at the questions on trust and alignment, we have found in every single case in every single country, in the more than 20 some analyses that we've done in countries, that there's always a very strong correlation. And that when parents feel that teachers share their beliefs, or at least understand their beliefs, they don't have to have the same purpose, but they at least understand where they're coming from on what makes a good quality education, then there's a strong correlation with parents feeling that their teachers value and respect them, and vice versa. That teachers feel valued and respected, they also feel that the parents really understand where they're coming from. And so this relationship between trust and alignment is really key, and having these conversations on beliefs and where parents and teachers are coming from in their beliefs is really key. And as you all pointed out, we bring our own experiences into our beliefs and our own ideas on education from our own experiences to education. And so having some time to really talk about that is really key. So I'm going to share some global data, and then I'm going to actually have give us some time to have a conversation, because I'm sure you're thinking, why can't you choose more than one? How do you get people to identify as one, and kind of what are the thinking behind the 4 categories? So I'm going to leave some time for us to talk about that. But I'm just going to show you across some of the teams globally. We've found that, which was the case here, is that socio-emotional learning tends to be one of the most important purposes of school in many countries and jurisdictions around the world. And so you'll see in the left grouping, from British Columbia to US to Australia to Brazil to Ghana, Malaysia, that socio-emotional was the main purpose. There are some jurisdictions where civics, particularly in one municipal in Brazil and in Zanzibar, Tanzania, where there's a very historically and movements towards more civic and community engagement in education, strong tradition as well as the current conversations. And then there are some communities, for example, in Sierra Leone, where 75% of the parents that were surveyed have not gone on to secondary school. 45% of the parents had not even gone to school because of the disruption with war. And they're really prioritizing academic and really helping their children, for many of them being the first generation of child to actually have gone through from primary school to secondary school. So they're focused more on helping their students get through school, so teachers. So that was one case in Sierra Leone. Otherwise, socio-emotional is the big purpose kind of globally. For parents, it can really vary. We have found that in some communities, socio-emotional is a very key part, and especially for parents of earlier grade from early childhood and primary school, perhaps this changes a little bit for parents' beliefs as their child gets older and goes into more secondary school. But there are, strong beliefs of parents in many jurisdictions about socio-emotional being the main purpose of school. In 2 different states in India, parents were still emphasizing the important civic purpose of school. And then in some jurisdictions, in many jurisdictions, really the academic purpose of school and having their child go on to post-secondary or finish secondary school being kind of what they saw as the main purpose of school. And then finally, we've started to ask students and children 14 and up to really reflect on what they think is the most important purpose of school. And then for most of the youth that we've talked to so far, representative samples in Ghana, India, South Africa, and Tanzania, and India, we found that kind of academic purpose for these secondary schools is on the top of their mind, and except for in Ghana, where socio-emotional learning and sort of the importance of relationships and self and values was the key for them. And so it can look differently in different communities, different jurisdictions, across different age levels of children, different education levels, different experiences of parents. But that having these conversations is really, really key. We also look at some of the barriers, and the key barriers from some of the recent research in the last couple of months we found for communities financial constraints. So whether or not they can get childcare, whether or not they physically can get to school, they have transportation money, or whether or not they can take time off work to be able to go to school. In Sierra Leone and Zanzibar was kind of the major barrier. Lack of time was in most cases one of, if not the top barrier, the top second barrier for families. So whether or not they can actually devote the time to engaging with schools was the key barrier. So we're going to talk a little bit about sharing and discussing, but I wanted to just stop sharing for a minute and give you a little bit of opportunity to ask some questions about the survey process. So I'm going to stop share for just a minute. And I know we had some questions sort of about, so feel free also to drop in the chat some questions. But the rationale for why we ask parents and teachers to choose one of the 4 is because if we give everybody the chance to enter as many as you want, generally the tendency is for parents or teachers to choose all 4 of the top purposes of education. So really it's not that those can't change or that that's the only purpose, but it often then allows us to have a deeper conversation of the one that comes up as the main purpose. And then for those that feel they write in the purpose, we take some deep time to really understand and to break that down in the conversation. So for example, I'm going to just pull from the chat this idea of the power of education to change lives. So where is that coming from? In the case in Zanzibar, that was also a strong theme. A lot of the teachers stated sort of alongside independence in the 60s, a long idea of education as the power to be the life changer, the importance for the new generation and building the communities and the civic. So we've found in some communities it's attached to sort of the historical ideas of education, but then also talking, what does this mean to change lives? And then having a chance. Is this more of thinking of it as economically, as personally, as social emotionally? And so families getting a chance to understand that, to be able to dig into what is our ideas on education, and then what is our beliefs on teaching, and what should we be teaching in schools, and how do we actually address these barriers? So the idea is, again, to sort of have these conversations, which is why we ask them to choose one, but then we also do allow for parents to enter in their own purpose, or teachers, and analyze where it's more than one purpose, where there's another purpose, and then having a conversation around that. So that's a little bit about the survey. I'm going to share out in a minute just how we then have the conversations. But before I jump to the conversations, I wanted to give you an opportunity just to ask some questions about the survey process. So you can either ask that in the chat, or you can also unmute yourself or raise your hand But I'll just give a moment for any questions. Okay, I'm seeing some good questions in the chat, so keep adding them in and I'll address these. So I'm seeing that some schools find it difficult to engage parent in surveys. How do you get participation for this? Great question. So we do some strategic thinking as a community when we're contextualizing and thinking about this. And so we often know when you send out an electronic survey link that you will get those parents, one, that are fluent in the language of the survey, that are used to taking the survey, that have the mobile phone access or the link access and can take the survey and are comfortable. So what we do is often thinking about how do you reach as many parents as possible. And so we encourage schools and work with schools to really target maybe 1 or 2 of the grades to really target all the parents. And in most contexts, there is a option. There are those parents that can answer the survey link, but then in for example, in Brazil, in their recent data collection, as well as in the team in Colombia, they set up at the beginning of drop off or at the end of the day time when there would be people that could do the survey orally with families in less than 8 minutes to talk to a parent about it, or some doing it over the phone. And so it's also often making the survey available in multiple languages. So if, for example, English not being the main language spoken, then having other options, and then having people, trusted other parents or other community members to help with the surveys orally. And so we work with teams on how do we get as many parents to engage and feel comfortable engaging. And so that's kind of a strategic thinking at the beginning. But what we found, whether it's England to Colombia to Brazil or Sierra Leone, the survey links will often get a very small proportion of families, and those that are probably already historically engaged in schools are more engaged and feel really comfortable with surveys, but not the families per se that we often are trying to get more involved and understand their perspectives. I'm also seeing a question on identifying the differences and opinions of parents. And it's great to be able to see what it has to be communicated about and the priorities of education, and a tool for gauging the beliefs. And so we have found that this is often just a starting point. The idea is not to say that all parents believe this or teachers believe this, but how do we start these conversations? What is a first point of having these conversations together? Feel free to keep asking questions in the chat. I'm going to continue with sort of how teams have been using the conversations, and then we'll have a little bit more opportunity to have kind of a question and answer and dialogue as we go. So let me share my slides again. And so the next step of the process is really to share and to discuss and to reflect. So in the communities that we shared the data on in Southwestern Pennsylvania in the US, one of the things that the school leader commented on is that when we used the tools and started the conversation, it immediately cut through the tensions in the community. It was like everyone exhaled, people started listening. So I don't know if you've kind of followed the conversations in the US, but we've had a challenge with conversations on social emotional learning and what is taught in school. And so it often can be a very contentious conversation about purpose of school and how to do that well. And so this team really thought very carefully about how they would do that. But it also gave them a tool that started with intentional data, which is often not happening in these contentious conversations. It's parents assuming they understand, teachers being very frustrated or scared with engaging in. And so to the superintendent's point, it was a way that we cut through the tensions that are there, but it gave a tool for doing it versus just an open conversation where people haven't really looked at or had a time to reflect on their beliefs and different beliefs. To this superintendent's also the point, was that sometimes it reveals surprises. So teachers often think they really understand their parents, but school leaders often think they understand their teachers' beliefs and their parents' belief. And in this case, the superintendents and the education leaders really had different beliefs than their teachers, and they had different beliefs than their parents. And so they were quite surprised. And the teachers didn't believe really the results of the survey because they found, okay, their perceptions were a little bit off from the parents. And so the superintendent had to release the whole data set, the raw data, so everyone could see that it was really, that the superintendent wasn't making it up. And so we found that sometimes with understanding the perceptions that we find that we have these formed beliefs of what other groups are thinking, but we don't actually take time to reflect on that. And so that was really from these learnings. In Colombia, they've been talking about socio-emotional learning and these deep beliefs, but also where is it coming from national frameworks and curriculums, but also how often those conversations at the national level don't often translate into parents understanding what's happening, and their discomfort isn't always acknowledged. And so those conversations also helped them to think about how do we have better communications with families. So we then work towards a strategy in developing and enacting strategies together. And so these strategies can look differently depending on the community and depending on the circumstance. Sometimes they're more activities. So maybe it's to the point of earlier in the chat, these events, rethinking through these events that we hold at school. How do we make them more authentic? How do we make them more inclusive? How do we do things differently? But also sometimes it can be task forces, but also thinking about everyday communication. How is communication happening? Is it just through some type of app? Is it on the phone? Is there points for one-on-one? Is it, do parents know how to engage with school leaders, or are they just engaging with teachers? So it's also thinking about these actions that can kind of happen in the more short term. And then it's thinking also, some teams are looking more also at programs and plans. So we have one country team that really wants to build this. So Sierra Leone that wants to build this into some of their teacher professional development and really intentionally having family school community engagement at the national level. We have another team in Zanzibar, in Tanzania, that's looking at their national policy and plan, and how the only strategy for family engagement is really these task forces or school management committees and councils, and that really doesn't engage the majority of parents. And so how can they reimagine these larger approaches in their education programs? We have sometimes school districts coming together, in the case of Pennsylvania, that they've come together to really fund innovative activities and to create collective materials on how to engage families and to learn a learning group across school districts. We have some that are really working on larger term policy. So Brazil is looking at this, as well as Colombia. How do we get it into the national level conversation? So they had a huge convening with the data they collected in October with school teams and the Central Ministry of Education. They had a huge convening to talk about it at the national level and to really come together with some collectives. So teams are using the data and doing it in different ways. And our work at Brookings is really to bring people together to learn from each other, but also to document this and to help us understand how we can use conversations towards different strategies. I'm going to just offer a moment again to pause and share and any kind of questions we have. In the last part, we're going to share with you some strategies that we've collected that may be of use, but I wanted to just give you a moment here if you have other questions that you want to share or ask. So feel free to raise your hand or ask in the chat. It's also okay if you don't have anything right now, because we'll have time at the end as well.
Can I just check, is it Mrs. Al Hilly looking to come in?
Hello.
Hi, were you looking to come in with a question?
No, sorry. Did it Did I have my hand raised or anything?
No, it was just you were off mute and I thought, oh, I didn't know if you were looking to come in. Okay, thanks.
No worries. I know this is a lot to process, so you might need time to think and then ask questions at the end, but I'll just give another 10 seconds. I'm a teacher as well, so I'm okay with pausing and letting you take some time to think. I'm seeing a question now in the chat. Sometimes our targeted support for families are not what families feel they need. What is the best way to address this? This is such a great question. And I think this really goes back to what we found is it doesn't matter kind of the continent or the country that we often have approached in historically family engagement as telling families what we think they need to hear. And that's really what we've kind of called the involvement. But engagement and creating the listening, we have found teams are using different strategies for hearing what families need. I'll give you a couple of examples and then we could share some of the strategies. We'll address these. In the case of India, they found exactly what you're saying. They created learning circles or listening circles. They meet once a month and they invite families in if they want to come, and they'll have a topic. So for example, maybe it'll be about what are assessment results being the lead conversation. Or they'll ask families to identify a comment or a question that they want to talk about. Is it about transportation? And so they've created these kind of open spaces on a regular basis, but they've worked with parents to design how those conversations take place, the time of day, where they take place, and how they take place. And so that's one strategy that teams have, just creating better opportunities to listen. Some of the districts that we found too in the US have had, like, they have somebody that has regular time every single month where parents can come in and have a conversation. And if they can't, they'll do it hybrid. So families that, can't physically get to school can join on a phone or etc. But they have it as just strictly time to listen to parents on what they need. Some are also using survey approaches to understand what supports and digging into this more. But generally, those are kind of some examples, and feel free if you want to kind of elaborate on that. I'm seeing another comment. The families who engage are not always the ones who would be your target, the ones you feel would most benefit. No matter what we try, we can't seem to shift this. And I think how do we engage those is a big conversation. I know we had a large conversation in Pennsylvania in December after their data and really dug into this. And this was the main issue. We have found that and we'll share some strategies that thinking about the school as the place where families engage is often reproduces these of who wants to participate in that physical space. So physically having, and this assumption that parents come to the space for events, come to the space for conferences or conversations or councils, that you will always get those families that don't feel comfortable in that space who will find it challenging. And so some teams are trying to think outside of having families come in, and where can they do that? We'll share some of those strategies. But it's also for us, just how do we even create opportunities to listen to those families that don't feel that comfortable or don't feel that they can engage with the conversation. And so there's a couple of strategies that teams are using that we'll share in a minute on that piece of it. And then I'm seeing sometimes creating a universal offer that supports targeted families with additional support to get them and helps destigmatizes. And that is exactly what we found in one of the strategies. So I think this is a great kind of segue for Sophie and I to go into a couple of the strategy examples that we've seen that address some of these questions that you have in the chat. So I'm going to hand to Sophie to go through a couple of the strategies that we have leaned into for this session. So Sophie, handing to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Emily. So yeah, like Emily just said, we've sort of curated a list of strategies that we thought might be inspiring or helpful for your own work, and kind of bucketed the strategies into these 4 areas, which are making schools easy to access, caring about mental health and well-being, using families as funds of knowledge, and using arts-based approaches. So in this first sort of category of making schools easy to access, this fits in really nicely with the questions that just came up in the chat. we've seen that like historically in the literature and in the field of family engagement, there's often this framing that some families, often the most marginalized ones, are hard to reach. And this may very well be true in many cases, but when we dive into the research, we often see that it actually might be more so that we have hard to reach schools than hard to reach families. And so shifting this thinking can be really key. And what we mean by that is that schools historically by design are not welcoming and accessible to all families, perhaps due to language or cultural barriers. Perhaps families are unfamiliar with the school system where their child goes to school if they are a newcomer to that area, so they don't know how to navigate it themselves. Or perhaps, as we've seen in the chat today, families have their own trauma with schooling experiences that make them feel uncomfortable in schools. So with this in mind, we have some examples of how to intentionally make schools welcoming and accessible to bringing families in. And on the other side of that, it can also be really effective to connect with families outside of schools. So instead of putting the onus on families to enter the school, physically come to the school to engage with their child's learning, instead putting sort of that onus on schools to meet the parents in other spaces where families feel comfortable. So the first example here comes from the state of Connecticut in the United States, and it's an initiative that has taken place in several districts across the state called Welcoming Walkthroughs. This approach is done at the school level, so a school, with the help of an external facilitator, will assemble a small group of parents, school staff, and sometimes students to actually walk through the school together and use an evaluation tool to collectively rank how welcoming their school feels across 4 dimensions. And those 4 dimensions that they use are the physical environment of the school's practices and policies, the school staff, and the written materials available in the school. And then after this walkthrough process takes place, the group of parents, staff, and students actually come together to review their assessment and create an action plan for improvement for their own school, which can range from adding more signage in languages other than English to hosting a family night at the school or any other things along those lines. This second example is sort of on the flip side. It's about intentionally engaging with families outside of the school. And this comes from our research partnership with 2 nonprofit organizations that support government schools in Sierra Leone. So we are working with these 2 groups to pilot the conversation starter tools that Emily just described. And so we are collecting survey data from parents. And these nonprofit groups, knowing that nearly 75% of parents at their schools had not gone to secondary school and nearly 45% never went to school at all, they decided to actually travel to marketplaces and other common neutral spaces in their towns to survey parents in addition to doing this in schools. And they found that this was a very effective way of capturing the voices of parents who were either uncomfortable sharing their opinion at the school, or they didn't even have access or transportation to the school in the first place. A second strategy area to lean into is around demonstrating care for students, teachers, and families' mental health and well-being. We talked about this earlier. We know that the pandemic has had and continues to have scary consequences on well-being and mental health writ large, and so strategies that can engage families on this topic specifically could be really needed and important today. So one example for this at a sort of larger scale comes from Ontario, Canada, where schools in this province intentionally ask their students and families about their mental health and well-being as part of their ministry's planning for the upcoming school year. So from this survey, they established 3 key messages for the ministry in terms of how to better support students moving forward, and sort of made this known to all school communities. And those 3 key messages were to 1, focus on funding for human resources and support staff for mental health in schools, 2, to increase access to family and community supports, and 3, recognition for how difficult the pandemic has been on school communities. And this second strategy around well-being comes from Pennsylvania in the United States. we worked with a school district there that knew that their families were really struggling post-COVID. And so what they decided to do is organize a wellness resource fair that they hosted in a school gymnasium. So at this resource fair, they invited representatives from community organizations and government groups in their own community that exist to support families, such as food banks or employment services or health services, so on, and gather all of these groups in one place and invite parents in so that this, they really tried to intentionally create a space to connect families with the supportive resources that they might need, but might not otherwise have access to or know how to access. And now I'll hand it back to Emily.
Thank you. And yeah, I will end up with just kind of two strategies, and we'll get you off at the top of the hour. But one of the other things that we've been talking about and thinking about in teams around the world have been thinking about in different ways is really using families as funds of knowledge. And so knowing that families have different experiences from school, but also we often see this as a deficit, as sort of their lack of experience with school, their lack of comfortability with school. But how do we turn that into also understanding how their experiences and histories and culturally based ways of knowing can help us build on a school? So what are some funds of knowledge or the historically and culturally based ways of knowing that comes from home that we can build into the teaching and learning, into the ways that schools work? But also thinking about this as funds of identity, which comes from kind of building on funds of knowledge work by Moll, but also Esteban and Guillard that talk about it as really what are these identity, these knowledges that are essential for a child or a person's self-definition, expression, and understanding. And if we want to sort of break these ideas that school is not for me, how do we make sure that schools reflect children's knowledges at home as well as their identities that they bring? And so I'm going to give you some examples of schools that have been doing this and trying to do this. And I should say that there's a lot of great examples across Europe. The Netherlands has been really working with this across the national level. Teams in Iceland have also been looking at funds of knowledge. There's a lot of great examples of how this is being done. I'm just sharing one from the work that we've been doing on in depth as well. And one being from, this is the school that I'm on the parent teacher organization for, my own kind of child in the kindergarten classroom, and the teacher setting up a whole lesson around this funds of knowledge. So what she did was, knowing that she had children from 16 different countries, the parents with different countries, created these days where a child, one of the kindergarten, the 5-year-olds would teach a lesson about Afghanistan or about Turkey or about Germany or about El Salvador or Colombia or Ecuador. And so the parents helped together planning these short assignments with their kids and creating some of the things that they wanted to teach them, whether it was about a space in the country, whether it was about a language or about a cultural practice. And then the children taught that, and the teachers helped look for books and information for the children. And then parents were invited virtually to sort of see this. And so the parents were able to sort of watch this. And so from a parent participating in my child with 5 other children that have parents that have come to the US from El Salvador, had an opportunity to really understand that and have it as a lesson in the conversation in the classroom. So this is one way that intentionally the teacher in the school sort of sought to build funds of knowledge. We have another example in California where at their staff development and professional development work, they really wanted to take an opportunity to listen to families, and to someone's point in the chat of how to really listen to those families who are not always the ones that are engaged or feel comfortable engaging. And one of these was that they identified as really experiencing of poverty and ability to be able to, the challenges that families go through on a day-to-day basis to get their child to school, to help their children with their homework, the stress of poverty in their home and the stress that it puts on as a caregiver, as well as a child, as well as complicating their ability to be able to engage as families. And so they created a time where they really listened, the staff and the faculty listened to, and they intentionally invited families experience in different poverty, either as a newcomer to the community, as a historically having lived in poverty and trauma with poverty in the community, and to really listen to these parents and identify some of the ways that families and schools could more intentionally understand. And so it was a poverty simulation where they listened and intentionally created that into their professional development. And it's been a number of teams in British Columbia and other places have also tried this because they also wanted to be able to have a better intention of listening to families and the day-to-day lived experience of trying to navigate school when you as a family are really stressed economically, and how to help build that conversation. So that was an intentional for education personnel. And then we'll end with some arts-based approaches. So we have some teams that are also looking at how to use the human experience and arts-based ways of intentionally engaging families in family and school community engagement. And so we have an example from Sindh, Pakistan, where a community organization working with the schools, they had mothers and children really take photographs of some of the different barriers, but also opportunities and the how some of the challenges with engaging with school in the environment and how to really envision of making this more welcoming and accessible for children. So they did this through pictures, and then they organized the pictures by different kind of groups of barriers, by different groups of opportunities, and to really actually see where these children's environments and the parents' environments and what when they talk about a barrier of transportation, what does that really look like? Or what do they talk about a barrier of feeling welcome? What does that really look like? And so using photographs to really picture that. I've been working with a team for 15 years in Zanzibar in Ministry of Education, and I've been working with youth to document their experiences in schools over the course of their from preschool on to secondary school. And I've been using stories with youth of really documenting their challenges, but also the family members and the communities and the ways that teachers have engaged with their families to support them in school. And so storytelling, this is a picture of the young people kind of performing and using theater as a collective way to propose solutions. So they'll perform their stories and then we'll have a conversation with the audience of parents or teachers, or what are some ways that we can do to help these young people with their experience with dropout and push out and the factors that are really making it hard for them to thrive in school, and using this as kind of a forum for open dialogue. So these are some of kind of the arts-based approaches that we wanted to share. And so we have been collecting these different approaches and have a strategy finder that will share the QR code so you can access, and the link we'll share in the chat. But these are really organized by different types of strategies, whether it's for parents in the home, whether it's for schools, whether it's for educators or policymakers, the different kinds of strategies. And we've been collecting these evidence-based strategies around the world and are continuing to build out this in the years to come to give communities an idea of the creative ways that schools and communities are using to engage families and to have these dialogues with families. So I think we will leave it here. We have the strategy finder link to share, but we also just wanted to leave a little bit of time to kind of respond to some of your thoughts in the chats. Take 4 minutes to do that. And any questions that you have, we can also address those. So I'm going to just go to the chat and just see if we want to address that. Have we tried getting children and young people to invite them in, if carefully and sensitively? Yes, we have a working group, and it looks like some of you have also shared the work you're doing, which is fantastic. We have a working group with our Family Engagement Network of those that are trying to engage students in the research and intentionally engage students. How to do that, not just with relying on surveys where we feel like we've surveyed children's voice by having them answer a survey, but really actually digging deeper into that and conversations and hearing and more youth-centered ways. So for example, the work I'm doing of using more storytelling with youth, or the work that's happening in Pakistan of using photographs and thinking about ways too also that youth may express, and how do we create these opportunities to get them involved. Welcoming schools in Connecticut, they have kind of the students that also go through the welcoming, and they kind of look at their own school and they create their own solutions as well. So they're very part of the process. But you're right that intentionally and carefully planning this is really important, and not just adding students into a conversation that isn't really created for them is kind of the learnings that we've had. And I see there's kind of also really great work happening of thinking about students and youth. And yes, if we just rely on surveys, I'm seeing to this point, we often get this, yes, we are so happy with school, we don't need to be more involved. But when we look at and use more creative ways in arts and other conversations, we actually start to unravel some of the different thinking and different creative ways. Just seeing if there's any, feel free also to come off mute and interrupt. I'm just looking through the chat about sort of the student engagement. And if anyone wants to kind of comment further on the work you've been doing involve youth, Fiona or Mrs. Stocks or anyone else, please feel free to chime in and share your experience.
Hi, my name's Jane Stocks, so it's me that's been putting some of the bits in. So what we tend to find is that, you know, when you have, like some of the ones we were saying earlier, when you have events such as school shows, you know, they'll come along, you know, anything that their kids are involved in, you know, they will be there. But if you want them, you know, to come and be involved in anything else, you know, that you're trying to get them to share their views with, etc., then some of them can be very reluctant. We'd asked parents before about workshops, would they be interested, you know, in coming to find out a bit more about things like digital learning, for example, because obviously there was a lot of things during COVID that came up from that, just different approaches to supporting their children with things that you put out. And we got back, you know, quite good response, a lot of people saying that they wanted to be involved, but then when it came to us organising a wee digital workshop for them, we only got 4 parents who were interested in coming, and those were 4 parents who didn't really need, you know, that input. So we find that that tends to be the kind of a pattern that we have in our school. We are in quite a deprived area, so we have done work with parents before on kind of a literacy and, you know, encouraging them to come in and getting to know them on a kind of a one-to-one basis and buddying them up even with other parents, you know, to see if we can bring them in that way. And sometimes what we maybe get off them is they'll say things like, oh no, we're happy with what the school's doing, we think the school's doing a great job, there's no need for us to be involved. And where that's nice to hear, and I don't mean that I don't think that's their thoughts, well, I like to think that's their thoughts, but I think sometimes they say that just to make you go away and stop asking them, which is maybe to do with kind of their confidence. Some of them maybe genuinely are not interested, but we do find that it's often the ones where their children could be doing, you know, with a little bit more of parental input at home, you know, and that it would support the parents as well, maybe sometimes in developing some relationships in the community and things like that as well.
Fantastic. Thank you for, and yes, echoing exactly what you said is something what we've been grappling with as well. I'm going to hand to Fiona just to share briefly before we start to wrap up. So handing to Fiona.
Yeah, I was just going to say a previous role that I had was very much about parental engagement in schools, and what we found was what you were saying with regards to parents not being confident. So what we found was things like Christmas card decorating, where you come in, you do the session with the parents and then ask them to help you with the children. So you're asking them so they know what they're coming into, they know what they're expected to do, they know what's going to be expected of them. A lot of the things we find with parents were a bit of anxiety around about, are they going to be asked to read, are they going to be asked to speak out loud, are they going to be asked to lead on something? So if you can take out as many of those barriers and give them as much information about it beforehand, then they're much more likely to engage, and especially if they think that they've got a helping role and it's something that they're contributing to, as opposed to necessarily having to learn, or their experience of learning has not necessarily been the most positive previously. And then from that, you build up the relationship to get them into the kind of learning stuff and having conversations with them around about what sort of things that they would find helpful.
Great examples. And just to echo before I hand back to Kat to close us out, that we found also mentoring of parents. So just to your point is that this fear of, oh my gosh, what am I going to be asked to do? So if it's really intentional, it's not centered around something that requires reading or literacy, but also this mentorship. So a couple of the schools that we've been working with have these programming where either a new parent that's new to the school, meaning their children are just entering school, or it could be a newcomer to the community, matching them with parents that look like them, that speak the same language as them, that have navigated the system. So one parent with 2 or 3 others, and they have kind of a support group to help the parents that really feel apprehensive. There's another school that has been working with fathers, that intentionally fathers had low engagement, and working with fathers and children, especially boys that are experiencing challenging with school. And they set up kind of around the hobbies and around a sport activity, like a regular meeting where they could just come and talk and create a community with a small group and sort of mentor each other and have these conversations and form these bonds. Some schools have, but we found kind of this idea around an activity or a hobby where everybody feels included, or different kinds of activities. They're intentional to gender, but also this mentorship and communicating, setting up these groups as well has been key. I'm gonna thank you all for these amazing ideas and suggestions, for your contributions, for your strategies. We will take them with us as we go. Please feel free to keep in contact and share your ideas and strategies, and to reach out to us. And I'm going to hand to Kat to sort of say goodbye and to close us out.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to both Emily and Sophie. We hope that you have found that really helpful. It's always good to get another perspective, and I think the research that you bring to this session really helps, and it's been so lovely to be joined by so many people from across Scotland today, so thank you very much.